Today's symposium on the policy and practice of Dr. Henry A. Kissinger coincides with the issuance of a Time magazine with Kissinger's picture on the front cover and the title, "A Moment of Danger." We believe that this moment of danger for Kissinger's foreign policies presents us with the opportunity to create a moment of liberation, an opportunity for the expansion of our critical powers concerning the United States and its role in the world. Now, this transformation depends upon our willingness to ask and confront certain questions. Why have the policies of Dr. Kissinger failed and brought us to this moment of danger? What exactly are those policies and how have they been implemented? What and who are those forces opposing these policies around the world, and for what reasons? And is this a good development or a bad one for the United States and for the world? It is with the aim of beginning discussion on these questions and hopefully succeeding in grasping the positive out of this moment of danger that we convene today's symposium. Although there is by no means political agreement among our panelists, they do share a common feature which we feel is important to point out, and that is that they have all been highly successful within established governmental and academic structures, from the National Security Council to the South Vietnamese Cabinet to Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And yet, all have chosen to step outside the boundaries of those structures and take a critical and even sometimes antagonistic position towards those institutions. And they have done this at great personal risk. Finally, the motivating force behind their action has been our government's policies and practices in Indochina. With all of this in mind, I want to introduce the first panelist. Each panelist will have 15 to 20 minutes to speak, and after they have made their presentations, there will be time for an exchange between the panelists, and then a question and answer period from the audience. Our first speaker today is Morton Halperin. He is a former senior staff member of the National Security Council who resigned in a protest over the bombing of Cambodia. Subsequently, it was revealed that Mr. Halperin was one of Kissinger's aides who had been wiretapped. He is currently the research director of the 20th Century Fund on National Security and author of Bureaucratic Policies, Politics, and Foreign Policy. Mr. Halperin.
Thank you. Is this working? Can you hear me in the back? No? How did you know what I said? Okay, I'll try to talk louder. I thought what I might do is just try to simply lay out what Kissinger's foreign policy in Indochina has been since 1969 and what it is today, and hopefully take less time than I've been allotted. I think that Kissinger's view has been right from the beginning that an anti-communist South Vietnam was vital to the security interests of the United States, and that everything possible must be done to maintain in power in Saigon either the Two regime or its equivalent government. That he recognized that the United States could not keep 550,000 American troops in Vietnam indefinitely, that the anti-war movement in the United States had reached the point where the troops would have to be withdrawn, to be sure as slowly as possible, but eventually most, if not all, of the troops would have to be removed. And therefore something had to be substituted for those troops, which would prevent the North Vietnamese offensives and the uprisings in the South, which would lead to a non-communist or the elimination of the anti-communist government in Saigon. And that, right from the beginning, the alternative to the presence of the American troops was that the threat to destroy North Vietnam, the threat to engage in massive bombing aimed to killing every person in North Vietnam if necessary and destroying everything in North Vietnam. And from the first days of the Nixon administration, these threats were conveyed to the North Vietnamese. First through the Soviet ambassador, Mr. Dobrynin, in conversations with Kissinger, then indirectly and obliquely through third-party contacts with Hanoi, later through the Chinese, and then, of course, directly to the Hanoi representatives in all the negotiations which Kissinger carried on, first secretly and then publicly in Paris with the North Vietnamese. And all these conversations, the message was the same. Unless we get the settlement that we want, which is the withdrawal of the American forces in return for prisoner exchange and assurance that the composition of the government in Saigon will not be changed, we will engage in massive bombing of North Vietnam. And these verbal threats were reinforced and made credible by the escalation of the war. The bombing of Cambodia begun in March 1969, just 2 months after they came to office. Threats to indicate that there would be mining of Haiphong when necessary, then the Cambodian incursion, then the Laotian invasion, and then finally the resumption of the bombing of North Vietnam and leading up to the Christmas bombing. All of these designed to make credible the threat that unless Hanoi would return the prisoners in return for an American withdrawal and then agree to leave the Saigon government in power, the United States would resume and carry forward the massive bombing of Hanoi. And it's in this context that one has to understand the Christmas bombing. The purpose of the Christmas bombing was not to get any fundamental change in the ceasefire agreement, since it was understood that all of this detail about ceasefires and supervision and number of international control commissions was all fluff that would not mean anything. The purpose of the Christmas bombing was to get the two governments to accept the ceasefire agreement. And what was necessary to get them to accept the agreement was the assurance, which is now, in fact, in the last hours apparently been confirmed by the State Department, the assurance that if they accepted the ceasefire agreement and the North Vietnamese then violated the truce agreement, that the United States would engage in massive bombing of Hanoi. And the purpose of the Christmas bombing was to make credible that we would resume and carry out such bombing at a later date if Hanoi did not observe the ceasefire agreement. And this was the Kissinger's expectation as he accepted that agreement. Not that there would be a political settlement, not that any of the political provisions would in fact be carried out, but rather that there would be an American withdrawal, the prisoners would come back, and then Hanoi would be deterred from an offensive by a combination of Russian and Chinese pressure growing out of the détente and the threat of the resumption of American bombing. Now, of course, what's got in the way of that, and in my view the only thing that's gotten in the way of that, is the absolute congressional prohibition on a resumption of any military operations in or over Indochina. This made it difficult to threaten that we would resume the bombing, but nevertheless we did continue to make those threats. Indeed, if you look at the annual posture statement of the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Schlesinger, delivered to Congress in January or February of this year, he says quite openly that we are maintaining American bombers in Thailand for the purpose, should it become necessary, and should, he says, Congress concur, for the purpose of resuming the bombing of North Vietnam in the event of a violation. So that the threats have continued to be made that we would resume the bombing, but they were simply not credible because of the congressional prohibition and because of the clear indication that Congress would not change the policy and permit the bombing. Now, I still think that Kissinger expected that if there was an offensive, Ford would at least ask the Congress to resume the bombing, and that the bitterness against the Congress, while it is stated in terms of the unwillingness to provide the military aid, is in fact bitterness against the Congress for imposing this prohibition on the resumption of the bombing, since Kissinger understands as well as everybody else that it is not the limits on American military aid that are responsible for what is now happening in Vietnam. So that I think the ultimate failure of the policy has come from the fact that the American public and the Congress have finally insisted that we would not go on with the destruction of Indochina, and that therefore you now have occurring what would have occurred in 1965 had the United States not intervened, which demonstrates the total futility, leaving aside everything else about it, of the 10-year American intervention designed to strengthen the Saigon government and to destroy opposition within South Vietnam and from North Vietnam. So the policy is, I think, now in ruins precisely because the public has finally put a stop to American bombing of Indochina. Well, let me stop there and we can resume it after.
Thank you. Our next presentation will be by Tran Van Dihn. Tran Van Dihn's last post with the South Vietnamese Diplomatic Service was that of charged affairs in Washington in 1963. In 1960, he was a member of the South Vietnamese cabinet, holding the portfolio of Director General of Information and member of the National Security Council. He is presently a faculty member of the Institute of Pan-African Studies at Temple University and a specialist on the policy and practice of Dr. Henry A. Kissinger. Professor Dihn.
Thank you. A few days ago, when I learned that the panelists symposium will be made of Noam Chomsky, Morton Halperin, and at the last minute, Branfman, I thought that maybe there's practically nothing I could contribute except to beat my retreat, and very orderly one. So I retreat to the Vietnamese background, which is always very safe. So my intention today is to present to you a topic called How the Vietnamese Think About Kissinger, which actually complete our education in this country, because in this country we rarely ask the Vietnamese what they think about problems. But I was already labeled as expert on Kissinger's diplomacy. So I probably would give you my last theory, because I'm the way out of last expertise. I have developed a number of theories, from the missing monarchy to the missing cowboy or something like that. But recently I came to a new one. It's called the 3M theory. And this is, I must say, as an academic, it's not mine. It's from a man called Rother. He actually was the movie critic of the New York Times. And he wrote an article about the movie in the 1920s and 30s. And he said that the movie in those areas is functioning or creating the 3M system. The first one is myth, the second one is magic, and the third one is monotony. So if you look at Kissinger theory and practice, it has been started as a myth, because there's nothing real as so far I can see. And people expect it to produce magic, which, as you know, didn't happen. And now he's on the way to monotony. So this is my last theory. In case you are interested, you have to invite me back here. So when we talk about how the Vietnamese think about that, I'm very sure there's a lot of people who said, which Vietnamese? Me or the PRG or Hanoi or the people in Saigon? So I would divide it, just for this lecture, the Vietnamese into three areas, which I call the Saigon Vietnamese, the Hanoi Vietnamese, and the PRG Vietnamese. So let's look at how the Saigon Vietnamese now think or write about Kissinger. Yesterday, if you read the New York Times, there's an article, an interview by Malcolm Brown with a Vietnamese called Dr. Tran Van Dihn. He's the chairman of the Social Science Department of the Buddhist University in Saigon. He's now the political advisor to General Van Dihn. And he said, and I will quote him correctly so nobody will have to go back to the New York Times and find it. He said, now Kissinger stands exposed as a phony, period. He's very important because if, and for some reason, General Min will be the transition man within the next period of 2 or 3 years. I don't know. I'm never going to speculate about the future of Vietnam. He will be a very important man to watch. So that is what he thinks about Kissinger. So anytime Kissinger goes to Saigon and negotiate in the future, he has to watch out that man. But there's another voice which I strongly respect. Is a professor called Lee Chen-tung, because the last few years he represents the voice of sanity in the Vietnamese community in Saigon, especially the academic community, which, as you know, in every country has never been totally moral. So this is what Professor Lee Chen-tung has written in January the 14th, 1975, in the Vietnamese newspaper by the name of Dien Tin. He said, because I want to maintain a little in me that is human, I have to say it here once again, that responsibility for the present situation lies with the U.S. and especially with Secretary Kissinger. You remember he said he has to say it in order to remain human. So here you have two opinions which are very fundamental in the future of the transition period in Vietnam, so we can say that is fairly representative. But the press in general now call Kissinger an American foreign policy by another name called Chạy Lang. Chạy Lang in Vietnamese is if you play the game with someone and suddenly you feel you lost and you get away without paying. And that is called Chạy Lang. And in the Vietnamese tradition, usually when you catch a man, he cut, deleted. You have to guess it. So that is the press in general, and I don't know what they mean by that, but it's a very serious accusation. This is it's more or less what we may call in this country in good English, a dirty traitor, something like that. So I suggest that now the most dangerous place for Secretary Kissinger to go would be Saigon. Now, we go to the Hanoi Vietnamese. And I must say something which I have thought a little bit more before I want to say it. You know, when the negotiation in Paris started, I read the newspaper published in Hanoi, and they always call him Tiến sĩ Kissinger. Tiến sĩ means doctor, which means PhD in this country. But it hurt me a great deal because, not that I know what the PhD means in this country, but because in my country, especially in Vietnam, Tiến sĩ is a very high rank. People are supposed not only intellectual but moral at the same time. For example, for 9 centuries in Vietnam, we have only 2,000 of them. And the most brilliant one was the father of the prime minister in North Vietnam, Tran Van Dihn. So to call him by that name to me is a disgrace to the father of Tran Van Dihn and my own father for that matter. But there's nothing I can say. I cannot send a letter to the Nixon and said, don't do it, you know, because PhD does not mean Tiến sĩ, because we have PhD in this country, it does not mean anything. But and now, it's a very interesting now. Now you read the press in North Vietnam. Kissinger not only is no longer respected, is no longer called Tianshi or doctor or anything like that, but he was demoted from the editorial page to the comic page, which is very interesting. Because, you know, in the Vietnamese tradition or culture, we have this saying, I translate it so we save time. If you have an inscription on stone, in 100 years it could be eroded. But if people begin to attack you by mouth, for 1,000 years it always remains. So Kissinger now is what we call the beer man, is a mouse target in North Vietnam. And this is a very, very dangerous, because that become what we may call an institutionalized enemy. So how I could prove it? For example, in the Nhân dân, which is the People's Daily in North Vietnam, which is an organ of the Central Committee of the Lao Dong Party, the Workers' Party, they don't call him now by Kissinger, but they call him by two words in Vietnamese, which is unstrailable. It's not deleted, but unstrailable. It's called Cút Kít. And it's a very difficult, because this is, the Vietnamese have 6 tones, and if you change the tone, it looks funny. Cút Kít is a noise produced usually by a rusty wheel, but there's a lot of other implication. Your imagination is good enough to imagine what it means, but usually it's something which is not serious, and something which is rusty, something which, well, I better stop there. And for example, in the Văn Nghệ of January the 10th, 1975, Văn Nghệ is a literary magazine in North Vietnam, which has no equal in this country, because this country doesn't have an association of writers and artists. North Vietnam has one, and they produce a literary magazine, so if you are published there, well, you make it, or something like that. And they call him Late Bet. Well, here again, it's very difficult to translate. Late Bet is like someone who are just crawling on the mud or something like that. In other words, but my point is not lost language you have difficulty to understand, but they demote him from the critical page, which too much credit to the man, to the comic page, which is the lowest one can do to a human being. For example, in the Thống Nhất magazine, it's a weekly which is more or less a very broad, politically broad magazine. They call him Tàn Hương Được Lạ. Tàn Hương Được Lạ means a charlatan in Vietnam who use only incense, ashes, and pure water, and claim to be a doctor or something like that. So again, you know, it's funny, it's not serious anymore. People would joke at that. So in Vietnam, he become now a joke. If you want more example, I think go and read all the newspaper published in North Vietnam. But I think the last and the most beautiful one come from the PRG. And I have taken the liberty to write all this because I want to explain it more thoroughly. Because the PRG now consider Kissinger as one of the personalities in the Vietnamese novel called The Kill. Incidentally, is probably the best known novel in verse in the Vietnamese literature, and there's a translation which is shown in the back. I'm not an agent for the publishing company, but I just been told that you can buy it in the literature table. And The Kill is more than a Bible for the Christian, because the Prime Minister in North Vietnam, I would even say that, I'm not saying by Thieu, but every other Vietnamese would look at it and see the image of his own or her own and his own country. This is I think it's a unique that I never seen in any country which has a book which everybody love it, everybody weep over it, everybody concerned it. Even in North Vietnam, actually in North Vietnam, the best translation is from North Vietnam. So in that book is a story of a woman, which in the Anglo-Saxon Protestant white society we would call a prostitute. but is a prostitute because of the society, because of the corruption of the society, which make her become a prostitute. She had to sell herself in order to save her father, who is condemned by a society which is reminiscent of Saigon today. And so she suffered greatly, and she had to go from one place of prostitution to another place and betrayed by practically every male chauvinistic possible and all kind of suffering, until she met a very decent man, a scholar naturally in our tradition, by the name of Thuk Sin. That's the second name. So he talked with her, he visited naturally her place, which is a prostitution place, and decided to marry her in order to take her out of that very unhappy situation. But he is already married to another woman by the name of Quan Thu. So one day he said, all right, I would go back to tell my wife, the first one, of his marriage with the second wife with guilt, with our heroine. But when he came back and talked to her, she always avoided. So he didn't have even a chance to talk about that. But she knows already. She had her own kind of CIA and tape telephone and things like that. So she said, all right, don't worry about that. Why don't you go back to your study in another city, like, to do research in Cambridge and place like this. So he went back naturally happy, like, no things happened. But at the same time, she went to see her mother and plot the arrest of Kyo. So, and they hired thugs, and they used narcotics too. It's very interesting. This happened about 300 years ago. They used narcotics, they drug her. So finally, they dragged her to the first wife's house, is Phan Thu. And she was there, and she reduced her to a what we call a naughty, it means a servant. And then she sent a messenger to her husband and saying that, well, please come home, we have a very good time together. And he did. And only that the last minute one evening, she said, oh, I just have a very interesting servant. And she produced guilt in front of him. What a kind of cruelty. And all the scheme and things like that. So, but Kyo was very, very interesting in this sense that she said that, well, I'm not going to be sorry about that. I simply want to characterize her like this. And I would like to read it in Vietnamese because it's important. It's bề ngoài thân thật nói cười mà trong nham hiểm giết người không dao. You see how musical the Vietnamese language is. And this is a translation from the paper called the South Vietnam Instruction, which the organ of the Central Committee of the National Liberation Front for the South. And they translate this way: such an oily appearance, such sweetness and profusion of smile is a kind of perfidy which kills without a doctor. And this is the article about Kissinger. And this is what the South Vietnam, the PRC, characterized Kissinger. I could not see of any other better characterization, because he become now an institution in South Vietnam in the sense that people now can laugh at him. Because in Vietnam there's a book which nobody knows who is the author, because everybody is the author. It's called Thieu Lâm. It means a jargon of laughter. And this is the sanity of the Vietnamese society, because in that book we criticize everybody, from the emperor to the Buddhist monk, especially the powerful and the rich. It's subject to all kind of attack. But it's a strength because we don't know who is the author. So I would like to thank Secretary Kissinger, because now he provides another laughter in the jargon of laughter of Vietnam. And this is a very important contribution. From now until the next 5,000 years, we can laugh at him. So I would advise some of you who are trying to find an interesting subject for your future PhD thesis. Somebody should now collect all the joke in Vietnamese about Kissinger and prepared a thesis called The Kissinger Tree in the Jungle of Laughter in Vietnam. Thank you very much.
Noam Chomsky, a full professor at MIT since 1961, is a scholar who has revolutionized the field of linguistics, and his work has a deep impact on the study of philosophy and psychology. Professor Chomsky was a leader in the national draft resistance movement and has become widely known through his well-documented critiques of American foreign policy. Professor Chomsky.
Well, I was more or less assigned the topic of Kissinger as an intellectual, so therefore let me begin with one of the most significant critical commentaries on him that I've seen lately, namely Jules Feiffer's latest strip, to pick up from where you left off. He has there's a picture of Kissinger talking into a dictating machine of some sort, and it says, "Memo to myself, Ray, effectiveness. Called a news conference, stated we needed to send millions more in aid to Cambodia to assure a negotiated settlement. They laughed at me. Went before a congressional committee, testified we needed to send millions more in aid to Saigon to prevent a bloodbath. They laughed at me. Held a deep backgrounder for the most influential and reliable members of the Washington Press Corps, confided to them that the domino theory has been reinstated. They laughed at me. Went to a dinner party, was terribly witty. Nobody laughed. I think there's something wrong with my act. I think Pfeiffer has grasped the essence of the issue more clearly than many of the political commentators who've been writing, ponderous books in which they attempt to discern some kind of deep purpose or far-reaching conception of international order in Kissinger's various pronouncements and his behavior. It seems to me that the real story, the real fact, is the one that Pfeiffer talks to, namely that the whole dazzling diplomacy is largely a play to the grandstands, and it's with the intention of disguising some purposes which are not very difficult to comprehend, the general purpose of reasserting American power through the maximal use of force everywhere in the world, and the specific purpose in Vietnam of striking a severe enough blow at South Vietnamese society so that the American-backed police state could maintain itself there. Kissinger's did have some triumphs, some real triumphs, but they were in a different domain. They were in the domain of manipulation of the media. The achievements that thrilled the political commentators were, for the most part, in the mind of the beholder, and therefore it's not very surprising that now that the love affair is turning a little sour, there's a sense of betrayal and even sometimes contempt as reality inevitably intrudes. There are two aspects of this that I want to talk about a little. The first has to do with the assumptions and the goals of Kissinger's diplomacy, or as he likes to call it, the philosophy that underlies his diplomacy, as this is revealed in his own writings on the subject. And in the interest of fairness, I'll only consider those prior to the time at which he entered the administration, since obviously one doesn't expect anything very profound of him after that point. Secondly, if there's a little time, I don't know how long this will take, I want to say a few things about the collapse of the Kissinger diplomacy as the facade finally was undermined by forces in the real world that he seems to have no awareness of or concern for. Well, in the first place, consider Kissinger's theory of international affairs. When you read his writings on this, his academic writings, I'm not talking about, there's a lot of complicated talk with big words like multipolarity and things like that, and it all sounds very impressive. But when you really get down to what it is saying, I think it turns out that to the end, he's an unreconstructed Cold Warrior who was rational enough to recognize and even in part to accept some of the limitations on American power. So despite the multipolarity, his ideal for the 70s was a world of two superpowers, and then really a world in which only one of them was really super. That is, as he put it, there has to be, in his revealing phrase, a penalty for intransigence if the junior partner steps out of line. Well, that's the basic structure of the world, and the substructure is this. Within where the real honest-to-goodness superpower, namely us, where that superpower rules, we have the following characterization of the organization. I quote, "Regional groupings supported by the United States will have to take over major responsibility for their immediate areas, with the United States being concerned more with the overall framework of order than with the management of every regional enterprise." So in short, other powers within our imperial system can have regional interests, but we, and we alone, have global interests. We take care of the overall framework of order, while the various sub-imperial powers may manage regional enterprises within our big corporation. The goal of this whole system is what he continually refers to as stability or equilibrium or the status quo, and there are several dangers to this goal which we continually have to face, and he identifies two basic dangers to this goal of maintaining stability. The first danger is what he calls the ideological leadership in some parts of the world, and the second danger is what he calls the charismatic revolutionary leadership. And let's see what kind of dangers these pose. I'll read his characterization. What is the ideological leadership? Well, that's the Marxist-Leninists. And I go on now to quote Kissinger, "The essence of Marxism-Leninism and the reason that normal diplomacy with communist states is so difficult is their view that objective factors such as the social structure, the economic process, and above all the class struggle are more important than the personal convictions of statesmen. Belief in the predominance of objective factors explains the Soviet approach to the problems of security. Nothing in the personal experience of Soviet leaders would lead them to accept protestations of goodwill at face value, as we, of course, do all the time." So, in short, the difficulty in dealing with the communists, the ideological leadership, is that they're concerned with the real world and its objective factors, and they foolishly refuse to enter into Kissinger's world of personal beliefs and sincere convictions. And now, how do we handle this danger? Well, in dealing with the Russians, he says, that is the ideological leadership, who have this strange idea about the objective world and its importance. In dealing with them, we should quoting again, we should concentrate negotiations on the concrete issues that threaten peace, such as intervention in the third world. Their intervention, of course. That is, we do not do such nasty things. In the Kissinger system, it is the Russians, the ideological leadership, who threaten stability by intervention in the third world, and they must pay a penalty for their intransigence for so doing. Well, a look at the facts of post-war history, which I'm not going to review, suggests a somewhat different picture. But the fact is that you can save this thesis from complete absurdity by supplying the hidden premise, namely that the third world belongs to us. So therefore, our involvement in the third world, whatever it may be, bombing, torture, destruction, anything, that's not intervention, because that's merely the normal state of things. So therefore, it is their intervention, when they somehow do something that threatens our ability to do anything we want in the third world. It's that intervention that threatens world peace, and that we must therefore deal with in our negotiating with these ideologists. Well, that's the ideological leadership, first major threat to world peace. How about the second, the charismatic revolutionary leadership? This is dangerous in the Kissinger theory because it leads to foreign adventurism in the post-revolutionary period. The incentive is strong to undertake an adventuristic foreign policy directed against the West, which lacks any effective sanctions. The West is neither prepared nor able to use the sanction which weighs most heavily on the new countries, the deliberate exploitation of their weak domestic structure. In contrast, China, with its high capacity for exploiting domestic instability, can use it as a tool of foreign policy, as in Africa, where China is a growing factor. This is offered to explain why China is so aggressive throughout the world with armies all over the place and so on, as compared with the United States, which lacks any effective sanctions to use when somebody gets out of hand, and which cannot exploit the weak domestic structure of other countries like Chile and so on. Well, this whole picture is so, outlandish that I don't want to try discussing it. Obviously no one bothers to refute it. What is worth understanding is that what it serves to do, and what it serves to do, of course, is to disguise in sort of a heavy German accent the real meaning of our quest for stability. In Vietnam, turns out we have particular problems with this, particularly severe problems with this charismatic revolutionary leadership. And the major problem in Vietnam, as Kissinger sees it, is this, quote, "The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, fighting in their own country, needed merely to keep in being forces sufficiently strong to dominate the population after the U.S. tired of the war. We fought a military war, our opponents fought a political one." In other words, the trouble is that they live there and we don't. And somehow that was really unfair. So we found it hard, really hard to respond to their adventuristic policies which were directed against us. And particularly that was so since we so lack effective sanctions that we could use and are so unwilling to use force in responding to their aggression as they fight in their own country against us. Well, let's move to a higher level of generality and get to the really deep problems. Mostly I'm quoting from Kissinger's book, American Foreign Policy, which came out in 1969. He, after reviewing many of the problems of the world, he gets to some really profound thoughts, which I'll now quote. "The deepest problem of the contemporary international order may be that most of the debates which form the headlines of the day are peripheral to the basic division described in this essay, namely the division between two styles of policy and two philosophical perspectives, the distinction between the statesman and the prophet. The statesman manipulates reality. By contrast, the prophet is less concerned with manipulating than with creating reality. The test of the statement is the permanence of the international structure under stress. The test of the prophet is inherent in his vision. The statesman judges ideas on their utility and not on their truth." Truth in quotes, because good social scientists don't use mystical words like that. No question about utility for what, of course. So we have the statesman and the prophet. The statesman is the good guy, of course, and the prophet is the bad guy. The statesman is the one who's concerned with stability. The prophet is the one who's trying to carry out change. Now, what is the origin of this fundamental difference, the deepest problem of the international order? I continue. As for the difference in philosophical perspectives, it may reflect the divergence of two lines of thought which, since the Renaissance, have distinguished the West from the part of the world now called underdeveloped, with Russia occupying an intermediary position. The West is deeply committed to the notion that the real world is external to the observer. Cultures which escaped the early impact of Newtonian thinking have retained the essentially pre-Newtonian view that the real world is almost completely internal to the observer. Empirical reality has a much different significance for many of the new countries than for the West, because in a certain sense they never went through the process of discovering it, with Russia again occupying an intermediary position. Now let's try to decode these profound musings. The deepest problem of the international order, these problems are not the kinds of things that trouble superficial minds like ours here, that is, problems like torture and aggression and famine and starvation and racism and so on. Rather, the deepest problem is that outside the West, people think that the real world is inside their heads. They don't know that there is an external reality. That is to say that, say, the peasants of the world think that there is nothing going on outside their minds, which leaves open the question of how they survive a single harvest, but perhaps that's in the next chapter. Compounding the problem of interpretation here is Kissinger's further analysis of history, namely when he points out that the prophetic style, remember that's the one that hasn't yet achieved the Newtonian insight that the real world is external to the observer, the prophetic style was in the ascendant during the period of the French Revolution, as well as in the contemporary uprisings in major parts of the world. What he's saying is that the French Enlightenment, Lenin, Mao, the Viet Minh, and so on, have all failed to understand that the real world is external to the observer. And this is the deepest problem of modern history. The French Enlightenment, in particular, which virtually sanctified Newton, escaped the early impact of Newtonian thinking in Kissinger's version of history. The North Vietnamese thought that the bombing of Hanoi was going on inside their heads. It was a headache, which is probably why they failed to respond to it in a rational fashion. It was not part of the external world in the other way. Now, and so on. I mean, the interesting thing about this discussion, which is pointless to pursue, is that it's, if you take it literally, it's really at the level of lunacy. There's no other word for it. There's no way to describe the view that he is putting forth, that most of the world, except for the West, which underwent the Newtonian impact, and that, of course, excludes the French Enlightenment, which didn't know about that, that most of the world doesn't know that there is an external reality outside their minds, except for the Russians, who are sort of halfway in between, and maybe we could help them along to see it. So what is one going to do with this? This is not just side remarks. This is the deepest problem of the contemporary international order, in comparison with which everything else is trivial. Several responses one might make. You might say, okay, off to the nearest asylum or something. Or you might try to find some hidden meanings in it. And if you search for some hidden meanings, you find that there aren't any. There's nothing there that you can see, at least. And so what can be concluded? Well, we have to add the obvious premise that Harvard professors don't talk complete and utter nonsense. So there really must be some deep inner meanings which we are incapable of discovering, from which it follows that we are incapable of comprehending the deepest problems of the international order. And to push it a step further, we are excluded from political debate, limited to superficial phenomena like aggression and famine and that sort of thing. We can only watch in awe as the really deep thinkers like Kissinger wrestle with the deepest problems of the international order, the great philosophical dilemmas of our time. Now, all of this is a very important part of the act and shouldn't be minimized. And it's particularly effective with those parts of the mass media that regard themselves as intellectuals. Okay, they're very much taken with this kind of thing, same way as the academic intellectuals, who go for this sort of business. You might notice in putting together these various remarks that I've been quoting that there is a kind of a stupendous irony in it. Remember that the problem with the communists was that they are concerned with objective factors. That's why it's so hard to deal with them. But yet when we get to the deepest philosophical problem of our time, it turns out that the problem with them rather is that they do not know that there is an objective world external to the observer. So something's going wrong, but I leave it to you to figure out what. Well, the missing, in a sense, it's really missing the point to talk about this as if it was intended as rational discourse. These essays on foreign policy are really to be regarded, I think, as a parody of what the academic intellectual is like. Not too false a parody, unfortunately. And it's because of this that it is taken so seriously by professional ideologists in the media and in the universities, because they recognize it and really assimilate themselves to it. Well, what Kissinger's really saying in all this is that the good guys, statesmen, they're the ones who seek stability, and the other guys are the ones who have all of these problems. They worry about objective factors, or they don't know that there's an objective world, or something deep and philosophical, but certainly nothing that could be dealt with by, say, political change or social change. Rather, it's something much deeper than that is required, so we might as well leave the world stable the way it is. It's not a new idea. Winston Churchill put the same point rather nicely to Stalin at the Tehran conference. As he describes it in his memoirs, what he told Stalin was the following: "The government of the world must be entrusted to satisfied nations who wish nothing more for themselves than what they have. If the world government were in the hands of hungry nations, that is, the prophets, there will always be danger. But none of us have any reason to seek anything more. The peace will be kept by peoples who live in their own way and are not ambitious. Our power placed us above the rest. we are like rich men dwelling at peace within their habitations. Well, Kissinger is just rephrasing this Churchillian rhetoric in a German accent and in more somber tones, playing the philosopher. The point is that we, with Russian assistance, will keep the peace, a special sort of peace that will serve the rich men within their ample habitations. There is no deeper idea than this. Let me turn very briefly to the Kissinger diplomacy and its collapse. I wanted to talk about a couple of areas, but since it's late, I'll keep to one, namely Indochina, skipping other things like the Middle East and so on, which are interesting in this connection. As far as Southeast Asia is concerned, it seems to me that we may look at Kissinger's policies when he got into power as being just a fulfillment of exactly what he said he was going to do before, like, for example, in his January 1969 Foreign Affairs article. When Kissinger has to deflect liberal critics, he talks about a decent interval and how his only purpose was to of course, extricate us from South Vietnam and then let anything that happens there happen, but after a decent interval. However, I think if you really look more carefully, it's clear that, as Mort said, that the decent interval was intended to be infinite. That is, what he was intending was to establish a permanent base of American military power in South Vietnam, and he explained how he was going to do it before he got into power. The United States, the negotiations that we should enter into, he thought, should ignore entirely, should avoid, let me quote him, we should avoid negotiating about the internal structure of South Vietnam. That we should avoid entirely. Rather, we should discuss only how to achieve withdrawal of external forces. Now, there's another element to this, the second part of the policy, which one saw as soon as he got into office, and that was a very sharp intensification of the American war against South Vietnam. For example, with such murderous operations as Speedy Express in the Mekong Delta in early 1969, which, according to official statistics, succeeded in killing 11,000 people with 750 weapons captured, which gives you an indication of who was being killed, and destroying, they claim, the NLF structure in this Mekong Delta province. And there were others of the same sort. At the same time, Kissinger extended the war with the massive attack on Laos and Cambodia, the so-called secret war, though one should point out that it was secret only because of the treachery of the mass media in the United States, which knew about it but decided not to publish it. The implication of these various policies is clear enough. Suppose that the United States can destroy South Vietnamese resistance by these measures, can at the same time develop a political framework based on the immense domestic military force that Kissinger was trying to reconstruct, I quote again. Thirdly, achieve withdrawal of external allies for the South Vietnamese resistance. And fourthly, avoid negotiations on South Vietnamese political structure. Suppose that all those goals would have been achieved. Well, then the United States would have won. That, in fact, was the Kissinger policy and had nothing to do with any decent interval. And the period from 1969 to the present is an effort to do this, to achieve these goals. Now, there were some setbacks. There were setbacks in 1972, severe ones, which forced Kissinger into signing the Paris agreements, in which the U.S. was compelled to negotiate with respect to the South Vietnamese political structure. Because recall what the Paris agreements said. In effect, they recapitulated the earliest founding documents of the National Liberation Front, which means that in truth, while Kissinger was lauded for his great genius by the press, the fact of the matter is that what he succeeded in doing in this great genius was signing virtually the founding documents of the front, as you can discover by comparing the text of the Paris agreements with things published, say, in Douglas Pike's reviews and that sort of business. But furthermore, the Paris agreements stipulated that there are two governmental structures in South Vietnam, namely the Saigon regime and the PRG, and that these two parties, as they're called there, are exactly parallel and equivalent, and that they are to achieve a settlement, peaceful settlement under conditions of democratic freedom, without U.S. interference and without the use of force, and after having done so, they are to proceed with unification of Vietnam, again without external interference from the United States. Now, on the face of it, That's a direct contradiction and a total collapse of Kissinger's intention not to negotiate with regard to the political structure of South Vietnam. So it would appear that the Kissinger policy collapsed and failed, but that's too quick, because there's another element of this that has to be stressed. As the Paris agreements were signed, in fact even before they were signed, Kissinger came out with an elaborate explanation of their content and meaning. And if you look at his explanation, which appeared, in a press conference reported in the New York Times and in White House documents, it turns out that his version of what the agreement said is diametrically opposed to them on every single point, literally without exception. Every crucial point in the agreements, his interpretation of what the Paris agreements say is exactly opposed to what they actually say. There's no time to run through it, but just to take the crucial case, with regard to negotiating about the future of South Vietnam, while the agreements say that there are two parallel and equivalent parties, and the United States is not permitted to impose any political tendency or personality on South Vietnam or to interfere in any way in it, Kissinger's version was that the United States will continue to recognize the Saigon regime as the sole legitimate government of South Vietnam, its constitutional structure intact, a constitutional structure which outlaws the second of these two parallel and equivalent parties. Well, if you think about that, these positions are in diametrical opposition, and an honest press would have said Kissinger announces that the United States is going to disregard Paris agreements or something of that sort. But in fact, what the press did was something quite different, which gave Kissinger a victory, a kind of a victory, at least the media victory, the kind that he achieves. Namely, the press almost uniformly simply recapitulated the Kissinger version as the content of the agreements, and they do so until today. Whenever the press uses the term South Vietnamese, it is showing that it has subordinated itself to the Kissinger distortion of the meaning of the agreements. Because according to those agreements, there is no such thing as the South Vietnamese. According to those agreements, it's a logical impossibility for the South Vietnamese to abandon Nha Trang, as the New York Times headline says today, because there are two parallel and equivalent South Vietnamese parties. And for us to recognize one of them, outlawing the other, as Kissinger did, is precisely to impose a political tendency or personality on South Vietnam, or at least to try to do so, hence to undermine the basic tenet of the agreement. And it goes on from there. Well, I won't, given the time, talk more about the effect of this. The press, in effect, by making the Kissinger version of the agreements into what the American public believes to be fact, gave the administration considerable leeway to conduct its extremely savage attack against South Vietnam in the effort to destroy South Vietnamese society, that being the only way to undermine the major political force in it. And to a certain extent, I think that the negative part, the destructive part of the American Kissinger's policy may have succeeded. The fabric of the society was seriously destroyed. The positive part, that is building a stable alternative based on military force and police in its place, that did not succeed. But Kissinger did achieve his media success. Well, finally, let me just comment a little bit on what seems to me the amazing hypocrisy of the debate on this whole issue in the United States. As you see it now, so at least within the mainstream of political debate, you see, at least I see two versions. There's one side which is saying that we should continue to help the South Vietnamese to defend themselves against aggression by giving them aid and so on, maybe even bombing. And then the opposition, the anti-war opposition, the liberal opposition to the war, says, if you read the editorials in the liberal press and so on, says, we have done enough for South Vietnam. We fought to defend their freedom, but they won't defend themselves because they're so corrupt and so on. And therefore, we should not expend their blood and money to help them and defend them any further. The fact of the matter is that what we have done to Vietnam, to South Vietnam, is virtually to destroy the society. We've been at war against South Vietnam, it's the only way to describe it, for 15 years, much in the way in which Germany was at war against France during the occupation, though, in fact, with far greater brutality and a far greater degree of destruction than the Nazis ever accomplished, and, I might add, without the achievement of the Nazis in constructing a government of some legitimacy. They succeeded and we did not. The whole debate about this matter between the opponents and the defenders of the, say, supplemental aid appropriation and so on reminds me very much of the Nazi reaction to the destruction of the Jews. which you recall was also undertaken for very noble ends. It was undertaken for what was called political hygiene, in the wording of one of the officials of the German Foreign Office at the time. Himmler described this in the following terms. He said, "To have gone through this," that is the destruction of the Jews, "to have gone through this and yet remain decent, that is what has made us great." By Himmler's standards, I think that our standards of greatness are unsurpassed.
Thank you.
I think a good place to begin is if even half of what's been said so far is true, how is it that Kissinger has the image he has? Why is he our most admired American? And just to put the question even a bit more pointedly, I wanted to just mention a few specifics. Under Johnson, the United States dropped 2,742,521 tons of bombs. Since Kissinger took office, we've dropped 3,984,563 tons of bombs. In other words, not only did Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon drop 3.9 as opposed to 2.7 by Johnson, but they've managed to drop the most bombs in history. Now that is a fact, and it leads to a very basic question. How did the man who has participated in dropping more bombs than anyone in history win the Nobel Peace Prize? And I think the answers to that are very deep, but just to keep going a little bit on the questions, we've all been reading the newspapers for the last 5 years. Reading them, one has a rather warm feeling to Dr. Kissinger. He's very genial. He's a very warm person. He has lots of friends. He's sincerely motivated. He's compassionate. He's doing the best he can in a very difficult world, etc. Now, I just picked up this book about Kissinger, which I suggest you read. I just want to read two of many quotes, which I found rather interesting, not so much as a personal attack on Kissinger, but getting at this question of his image. One is from a boyhood friend who was in the town that Kissinger went into after World War II. When the Americans occupied the town, Kissinger became sort of the mayor during a year after the occupation, and the friend says, quote, Kissinger told complicated stories about how he would get the women who wanted to ingratiate themselves to those in authority. He always talked in manipulative terms. He was the man with the gun, the jeep, the coffee, stockings, chocolate. Those were important things. And he always told stories about arresting Nazis. That's one quote. And the other one I wanted to read is from another friend. A Harvard friend thought Kissinger might be making some false assumptions about selling himself short. What you have to remember about Henry is that he's a creep nobody would ever eat lunch with. He was the kind of kids other kids would steal a candy bar from just for pure meanness. He had a terrible childhood. He was a grind. He thought of himself as a hopelessly asexual object. All of a sudden, he gets some power and everything changes. He really isn't a creep anymore. Now it's conceivable that he might be appealing to women. He doesn't understand that. He thinks it's just power. Well, when you talk to people who know Dr. Kissinger, you find time and again that he is obsessed with power, that he manipulates not only his personal life, but there's no distinction between the manipulation of his personal life, his public life, and all the rest. Well, the point is that people hang around with him, the people in the media, his admirers in Congress, they know all of these things better than any of us. Why is it that they have, for all of these years, kept Kissinger's public image, despite the fact that they know what he's like in private? Well, there are lots of answers to that on a bit more sordid level. It's with journalists, as we all know, a journalist succeeds by getting scoops. If Dr. Kissinger wishes to give him scoops, that journalist goes to the top pretty quickly. It's in his sort of material interest, as well as anything else, to keep on very good terms with Dr. Kissinger and the rest. But I think there's a much more profound level that this question there are lots of places to start, but I think one of the things that struck me the most was a statement by Eagleberger, his aide, defending him in the New York Times, when he said that Dr. Kissinger lost 8 members of his family to the Nazis, and therefore it's inconceivable that he could be indifferent to human suffering. Just on that, while I'm at it, one other statistic, 860,000 people killed, Vietnamese killed under Nixon, 680,000 under Johnson. How does one explain that? On the surface, that sounds like a rather compelling argument. It struck me very much when I read that because I once lived in Israel in a kibbutz and had occasion to not only meet but sort of work with on a daily basis survivors of the German experience during the 30s. And at least in my experience, I don't want to say it's generally true, but within the kibbutz, people who had come out of that experience in the 30s had a very cynical view of human nature. It's kind of understandable. When you are a Jew going up in Germany, it's very hard to put your faith in your fellow human beings, to believe that man is anything other than intrinsically evil. One found within the kibbutz that people who'd gone through this experience tended to be the most difficult to deal with, people who were very untrusting of others, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one found that the fact that Dr. Kissinger did go through this horrible experience in the 30s need not necessarily have made him a very compassionate human being, but he did go through that experience, and I think that is a place to think of start, because not only did Dr. Kissinger go through that experience, but a whole generation did. A whole generation, which was presently in power, went through a very horrible experience in the 30s, a period in which the lines between good and evil were very clearly drawn. And then when at the end of World War II, the world was pretty much in ruins, except for the United States, there was no questioning of the right of American leaders to then pick up the ruins of the French and British empires, move into new areas, and in fact create a de facto empire, whether you want to call it a system of multilateral, multinational commitments, binational commitments, or an empire. I'll just use the word empire because it's shorter. Whatever you want to call it, that's what was created after the end of World War II. Now, of course, what's happened over the last 30 years is that this empire has begun to crumble, and those who have seen it as their goal to maintain this empire have seen it falling into sand before their very eyes. And we're now at a very crucial point in 1975, as Vietnam is ridding itself of foreign intervention, a very critical point really to discuss what, not so much Dr. Kissinger the person, but Kissinger as representing something, as a symbol of something. I think that historians 30 or 40 years from now, looking back on Kissinger, will find him a much less interesting figure than people do right now, because what is regarded as great accomplishments, détente and the rest, were really not détente as it's normally understood, a relaxation of tensions, general progress towards a higher goal, but quite clearly something out of Orwell. If you've ever read 1984, you remember the image of the 3 great superpowers, Oceania, East Asia, Eurasia, deciding not to compete for power over what Orwell calls the marginal frontiers between the great superpowers, but to divide them up into great spheres of influence. Quite clearly what Kissinger was trying to do through détente was simply to try to make it in the interest of the Soviet Union and China to go along with an American empire in the Third World, backing up military dictatorships around the globe, through, for example, with the Soviet Union, giving it a windfall of a wheat deal, and most importantly, the great influx of capital and, above all, advanced technology. It was a kind of trade-off in which Kissinger tried to make it in their interest to collaborate in this conspiracy against the poor and dispossessed around the planet. And it's quite clearly an experiment, I think, that has already failed. Let's just take Vietnam as an example. Now, the Soviets were supposed to, because they were getting all these good things out of us, were supposed to put a brake on their allies in Vietnam, basically sell out the Vietnamese. What we're seeing right now is obviously quite the contrary. And it's only one very dramatic example. I wish Noam had a chance to time to talk about the Middle East. Maybe we can get to it in questions, but I think the case against Kissinger in the Middle East is equally, if not stronger, against Kissinger in the Middle East as it is in Indochina. I don't think anyone sees what's about to happen in the Middle East as anything other than a disaster for everyone concerned. And we could have, if we'd had time, discussed why Kissinger's policies have directly contributed to that. But I think the point is very clear that now in 1975, this notion of trying to preserve this 30-year empire by making arrangements between these three great superpowers is coming to an end. It's coming to an end in a very bad kind of a way. Kissinger, I think, will be the last American statesperson perceived as a great statesperson. His Vietnam policy, I think, illustrates that. We've been talking to people in the State Department for the last 2 years, including some who are very close to Kissinger, and we always ask them one basic question. Look, you know that you can't stand up to the other side. You know he's not implementing the agreement. Why don't you do something about it? Why are you provoking the other side into an offensive? And time and again they tell us, look, well, I don't make policy, Kissinger makes it. All right, why do you think Kissinger's doing it? Well, Kissinger doesn't really have a policy. He doesn't like to think about Vietnam. He never talks about it. Well, we can go into why that is perhaps a little later. I don't want to get off on this sidetrack. I think, to sum it up, I think that the Vietnamese, during this negotiating process, administered very severe defeats to Kissinger, so severe that he has some kind of mental block for the last 2 years until quite recently in thinking about Vietnam, but that's a side issue. The point is that he's sat back for 2 years. He's been on the defensive in Vietnam. He hasn't had a policy. He hasn't had a solution ending the war, and he is, at least in my opinion, directly responsible for what's happening right now. This all could have been avoided. He knew it could be avoided. He knew that if he did nothing, this would happen. Well, I think that this defensiveness, this inability to really come up with a new policy and a new programs to deal with the future in Vietnam is characteristic of an entire generation's failure at this crucial stage in our history. I think the media, the congressional, with the exception of course, of people like the prophets on the platform, the question now is why has the media, why has these congressional opponents, liberals, whatever you want to call them, gone along with the Kissinger nonsense? I think it comes very much out of an exhaustion common to all great powers at the end of their empire, an inability to face the future. What's always struck me so much about Kissinger is this very deep responsive chord he strikes when he talks about the death of civilization as we know it, the chaos that awaits us, the anarchy that awaits us. Well, what's unimportant is that he says that, as I've suggested. It's quite normal given his origins that he would think that way. But when you think that James Reston thinks that way, that Senator Fulbright, who almost rivaled Kissinger in this kind of worldview, thinks that way, you begin to see that there's a pattern among those now running the society, which, although they're divided about where we should go, there's one common theme, that wherever we're going is bad. It has to be, perhaps we can try to solve it this way, or delay the inevitable horror this way or delay it that way. They may disagree among themselves. But really there's no place to go but down. Well, I can go on that, but the last area that I wanted to discuss was what does this mean for all of us who may not share that point of view. I think that it means some very serious and very important things. To begin with, I don't think that you can build a movement, I don't think you can regenerate a generation based on a vision of the future which looks towards chaos, based on a notion of human beings as intrinsically evil, as the best you can do is sort of prevent them from eating each other alive as cannibals or something. And I think that what's necessary, first of all, is a new, to use the favorite term, conceptual framework, which sees what's going on right now as not a horror, but as something that might, in fact, gladden the hearts of many of us in this room. To see what's going on right now is the end of a 30-year empire in which millions of people, billions of people around the world have been condemned to perpetual hunger, poverty, disease, worst sort of oppression and repression. And if this process is accelerated, a fairly quick shift over the next 30 years with all the horrors that will take place towards the people of the third world reclaiming their own land, reclaiming their own national boundaries, reclaiming their own resources, and using them for their own, for the benefit of their own people. What I think it means for us back here is that we no longer have models, thinkers, among at least the vast majority of those who we now regard as opinion makers, who we now take seriously to cope with the next 30 years. If it's true that Kissinger's conception of the world comes out of the 30s, and it's now 1975, and we're thinking about the year 2000, it's quite clearly that not only is it immoral, Kissinger's view, not only is it incompetent and inept and not able to work, but it's irrelevant. It has nothing to do with the world that we're looking forward to. And if it's true that the key opinion makers in media and Congress and academic circles admire Dr. Kissinger, it means that those people too have no lessons for us. They have nothing to teach. They have some things to teach us, largely in the area of what's to be avoided, but they don't have very much to teach us about how we're going to cope with the world over the next 30 years in which our empire does dissolve, so that our economy does go downhill, so that we have less resources to exploit of other peoples around the world, in which we have to build a new kind of society based on living within our own resources, hopefully, of course, trade and all the rest with the rest of the world, but on a much more egalitarian basis. And I would suggest to you that that is our great task, to reject the kind of view offered by Dr. Kissinger, and to begin building for this future. The way I can put it, perhaps, is that if this nation is to survive, it's people like us here who have to be writing those history books 30 or 40 years from now about Dr. Kissinger, and not his successors. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. We'd like to ask people to focus their question and direct it to a particular panel member. And again, this is not a period for extended speeches. Please limit your questions, or else I'll probably cut you off. We're trying to focus in here and take advantage of all these very impressive speakers up here. So,
Paul, can I add a word? Yeah. I just wanted to add one word that I forgot, that I wanted to mention very strongly about the Georgetown Indochina Studies Group, about what what does one do at this campus, let's say, if one is even interested, even if one gives 50% credibility to what's been said up here today, what does one do about it? And I just wanted to mention what for me is significant about the Georgetown Indochina Studies Group is really two things. One, that when you take one little area of the world like Indochina, although we think it's a pretty important area, and study it, you start to find out what Dr. Kissinger's foreign policy means, what his generation's foreign policy means in very concrete terms. It's no longer just throwing around rhetoric. You're finding out in very concrete terms what Indochina is, and you can kind of extrapolate from Indochina to the rest of the world, so that I think that people who are interested in exploring this more further, one way to do that is to get involved with the Georgetown Indochina Studies Group. A second thing I just want to mention on that is one of the things that the Georgetown Group does is participate in the political process, either through arranging for visits to Congress people from students or whatever, and that this is the real answer. It's not just a question of studying or reading or writing, although all of these things are very important. It's a question of acting. Because a lot of people did act during the 60s, this thing is finally ending. And while it's not ending very nicely, at least it is ending. And it's ending with a Vietnam free from American interference. If people hadn't acted, it wouldn't be ending this way in Indochina. It might still, it might have either been destroyed from nuclear bombs long ago, or they could have kept in power something like the Thieu government. And I think this is just one concrete illustration of why the real answer to the problems we're talking about today is not only thinking, but some kind of action, some kind of participation in the political process, because as Noam Chomsky suggested, one of the goals of the policymakers of a Kissinger is to mystify people, to make people feel that they're so stupid that they really don't know the facts, and to stay out of the political process and leave it to the great thinkers. And the only answer is to that is to get involved. Thank you.
Okay, we're open for questions. Yeah.
I'll repeat.
Yeah, okay. I'll repeat the question. Yeah, go ahead. The question is to Professor Chomsky, why have Dr. Kissinger's attempts for peace in the Middle East failed? Is that it? Okay.
Well, let me answer that both. That's extremely interesting and I think extraordinarily important question, which has to do not with the last intervention, but with what may very well be the next and greater one. Let me first answer it narrowly and then more broadly. Narrowly, it has to do with the question, I guess, of the latest shuttle diplomacy. Why did that fail? And the reason why that failed and had to fail, in fact, even if it had succeeded, it would have failed. That is, even if there had been an agreement reached, as there may yet be within Kissinger's framework, it will fail. And the reason is because it follows at once if you think out the consequences of success in that program. Suppose, this is the program that Kissinger and they jointly with the Israeli government are now pursuing and hoping somehow to implement. And that is that if it works, then the southern front will be neutralized. Okay? That is, there will no longer be, as long as the agreement is in force, a potential conflict between Egypt and Israel. So the southern front is neutralized, which means that there's no military danger, no matter what policies Israel undertakes. Now, we know what policies they are undertaking under the Kissinger plan, and I'll come back to what the Kissinger plan is in a moment, or has been at least. But what they are doing, and have said that they are doing, is carrying out development programs within substantial parts of the occupied regions. For example, within the Gaza Strip and to the west of the Gaza Strip in northeastern Sinai and in the Golan Heights, and down the Jordan Valley, and in substantial parts of the West Bank around Jerusalem. Jerusalem is sort of a slowly expanding concept of unknown boundaries at the moment. But these programs will continue if the Southern Front is neutralized. There'll be no force to prevent them. So that's the consequence of Kissinger's success. Now it's plain that whatever the leadership of the Arab states may feel in private, and they may not care that much in private, but the fact is that under the conditions that now exist in the Arab world, they are unable to accept arrangements. Maybe for a short time they can, but they're unable to accept arrangements which have the consequence that Palestinian nationalism is suppressed and destroyed by Israel totally, because it will be finished if these programs go on. And secondly, that the substantial parts, probably the bulk of the occupied areas, are developed by Israel, integrated, and ultimately finally annexed even. They can't accept those policies, which means that the Kissinger program cannot succeed. There must be, if there's going to be peace in the region, it'll have to be through a completely different, and incidentally, I might say that within the Kissinger framework, it's entirely understandable why Israel refused to accept the arrangement. That is, if you accept the framework, which I just outlined, then Israel is, I think, probably within its rights in saying, look, we can't accept this way of working it out within this framework because we're yielding too much and not getting enough. And most of the debate in the United States, in particular in the press, which as usual is just, kind of off the wall on this issue, is over whether Israel was right or wrong in refusing to accept that particular arrangement. That's not even the issue. The question is whether this whole framework is right, or whether another framework is right, one which puts at the central point the question of accommodation between Israel and the Palestinians, and then lets the other things fall into place as they will around it. That other framework could lead to peace, but that's not part of the Kissinger plan. Now, I've mentioned Kissinger plan a couple of times, so let me come back to a broader sense in which the Kissinger policies failed and will continue to. If we can take Kissinger's word for it, as expressed by the Kalbs in their book, which seems to be mostly Kissinger, I guess kind of Kissinger sycophants of some sort. So assuming that their account from Kissinger is correct, Kissinger on this issue, it isn't on many others, but I don't see why it shouldn't be on this, but if it's right on this, then Kissinger took over direct control of Middle East policy in the summer and fall of 1970. Now that's interesting, because at that point the policy shifted considerably. Up until that point, American policy had been essentially the Rogers Plan. The Rogers Plan, which incidentally had been accepted by Egypt, called for a return of Israel to its 1967 borders, with minor modifications, within the context of a general peace treaty. The Rogers Plan, incidentally, offered nothing whatsoever to the Palestinians, zero. But quite apart from, and for that reason I think was a totally unacceptable plan, but putting apart questions of right and wrong and just thinking about consequences, if the Rogers Plan had been adopted, I think there's every reason to expect that there wouldn't have been a war, at least yet, maybe ultimately, but there wouldn't have been the October 1973 war, because the fundamental, at least one of the two main things that led to it, namely Syrian and Egyptian irredentism, would have been overcome. The other main thing that led to it, namely the destruction of Palestinian nationalism, wouldn't have been overcome, though it might have been through a Palestinian state or something like that. In any event, had the Rogers plan with all its faults and inequities and so on been accepted, I think that there would have been no war. But Kissinger took over and the Rogers Plan was abandoned. And instead what was introduced was the Kissinger Plan. And the Kissinger Plan called for Israeli annexation of the occupied territories. It wasn't put quite so boldly, but what it amounted to was this, that Israel, with the United States backing it every step of the way, would proceed to carry out development programs in most of the occupied areas, thus sort of building facts, sort of building the structure of the future settlement by virtue of the development programs that it was carrying out. And that's what happened starting essentially in 1970 under the Kissinger Plan. It had begun before, but it really picked up at that point. And that went on until it reached its peak in August 1973, just a couple of months before the big war, when the in their electoral program for the forthcoming elections, never held, or delayed because of the war. In the electoral program, the governing party, the Labor Alignment, offered a program which came very close to calling for annexation. It was a program for the kind of control over the occupied territories, in particular the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and Golan Heights and so on, that was just a shade away from annexation. Now that program, incidentally, was formally dropped after the war, though it's now being sort of slowly implemented once again informally. Now that was the Kissinger plan, and of course that led directly to the war, along with Kissinger's refusal to respond to Sadat's initiatives, whatever they meant, like, for example, expelling the Russian advisors and so on. Now, that's actually typical of Kissinger. So, while the press was sort of lauding Kissinger for his genius again in settling that war short of total annihilation, it failed to point out that that war was Kissinger's responsibility more than any other person. He is more than any other single person that I can think of responsible for the fact that that war took place. It's a direct consequence of the policies that he followed. And the same intellectual failure shows up here as shows up in the Indochina case. Again, putting aside questions of morality and anything like that, and just trying to talk about rationality or, something like that sort. Kissinger is incapable of dealing with any issue except the question of force, as far as I see it. It shows up in his writings, it shows up in his actions. Social factors, economic factors, political factors, popular movements, these things just don't exist in his world. He doesn't understand them, he's not interested in them, at least he shows no interest or comprehension, they're just not there. His world is one in which statesmen converse on the basis and interchange their sincere convictions, and in which there's a big club sitting there with which you can hit anybody over the head who doesn't do what you're supposed to do. And that's about it. It's on that level of sophistication. And to make it look, sort of more serious, there's all the nonsense of the kind that I was talking about, which is really strict nonsense. But and the reason why the Kissinger initiated his Kissinger plan in 1970, I gather, is that at that moment, it seemed that a realistic assessment was that Israeli force was unchallengeable within the region. That was a not implausible conclusion, false it turned out, but not implausible conclusion at that period. Why? Well, the war of attrition had ended on the Suez Canal with Israel in what appeared to be a very favorable position. They had deep penetration bombers, Phantoms, which they'd used. And furthermore, Hussein at that point moved against the Palestinian guerrillas and pretty well crushed the Palestinians, it seemed. And, in general, it appeared, all the at least public intelligence estimates that I read, either from Israel or the United States, suggested that Israel's position was, from a military point of view, unchallengeable, and that Israeli economic dominance was actually going to increase in the foreseeable future. There were all kind of projections about GNP per capita and so on and so forth. So under those conditions, it seemed that this was not an implausible plan, and Kissinger adopted it, and it led to the 73 war, and it'll lead to another war if it's pursued.
Yes.
I would like to make a comment. I'm afraid that all conclusions by the audience may be wrong. In the sense, Noam Chomsky mentioned that Kissinger is not Kissinger the individual only, but that Churchill did the same thing, was very similar. And Branfman said that his successors are not going to be better than.
Can other folks hear what's being said here? Once again, I'd ask people to please focus their questions. I think Fred wants to respond to this. Did everyone hear what was being said?
Well, it's a little hard to repeat the whole comment, but the basic comment was that we're making Kissinger a scapegoat, there are many other factors, and what was mentioned was the Egyptians want to take Egypt for Egypt, the Vietnamese want Vietnam for Vietnam, the Portuguese want Portugal for the Portuguese. And then the question was specifically is if Kissinger were to go, wouldn't we get somebody else just like that? And just a very brief comment, I agree with about half of that, is one isn't making Kissinger a scapegoat because one has something personal about Kissinger. Kissinger has chosen to make himself the architect of our foreign policy. He is the person making our foreign policy right now, and he also happens to have been made by the media and other people, other opinion makers, the most admired person in our society. It's impossible to think of starting to develop a new foreign policy, a new way of thinking, until a lot of these attitudes towards Kissinger have been changed. I certainly agree with the statement that there are many other factors involved than simply Kissinger's failings. But all I can say is that I do, as I was trying to make say in my statement, I do regard Kissinger as only symbolic of a class of Americans. I do think that he is no better, no worse than a lot of others who probably would have done more or less the same thing, although he seems to be more successful in manipulating the media. And that what he's really all about is the end of an era. He's the last custodian of the American empire, if you will. And that precisely because people throughout the third world are rising up and taking what's rightfully theirs, neither Kissinger nor his policies will be able to survive very long. As for the immediate question, what would happen if Kissinger went, I don't think there'd be too much change immediately, but I certainly think if we think over a relatively short time period, in the next 5 or 10 years, there will be very substantive changes in American foreign policy because policymakers will have no choice, and because I think there'll be a growing movement in this country over the next decade which will limit their options even more and hopefully begin to create a new kind of foreign policy, a new kind of society.
Yes, here in the middle.
My question is directed to Professor Chomsky. I want to preface my question by saying I enjoyed your expose or whatever about this article. My question is, you mentioned the capture of Tran. One of your points is you talked about the Tran in the context of hypocrisy in the media. The media was being hypocritical by saying that South Vietnamese surrendered the city, and it was wrong because of that. South Vietnamese also captured the city because there are two governments in South Vietnam, the PRC and the RC. But my question is this hypocritical of you not having mentioned the 1898 that were also in South Vietnam and helping out the PRC taking places like Vietnam?
Did everyone hear the question?
The question was whether it's hypocritical of me not to mention to say that he was referring to the comment that I made when I said that I didn't actually say it's hypocritical of the media. I said it's a logical contradiction for the New York Times to say South Vietnamese abandoned Nha Trang. It's a logical contradiction if you accept the Paris Agreements. Of course, if you don't accept the Paris Agreements and you accept rather Kissinger's version of them, in which it's a civil war between South Vietnam and North Vietnam, then it is possible to have such a headline. That was my comment about Nha Trang. And the question that was raised is whether it is not hypocritical of me to talk about this incident so without commenting on the, what would you say, 18 North Vietnamese divisions, sort of outlandish number, that were involved in the capture of that city. Well, I think not. I wasn't if you want, I could talk about the whole context of the war there. There certainly are North Vietnamese fighting there, and substantially, in fact. Although there is, to be more accurate, there's very little fighting going on, it seems. There are North Vietnamese there, and the reason for the collapse of the Saigon government army is the presence of the North Vietnamese there. That's substantially true. I don't think it was hypocritical of me not to mention that because it had really nothing to do with the question that I was talking about, but I'm glad to do so. And the fact of the matter is as follows, as I see it. See, when the Paris Agreements were signed, they gave what struck me as a reasonable basis for settling the conflict, as reasonable as could be after this amount of destruction and terror and so on. The United States never for a moment intended to observe those agreements. That's why in the Saigon government areas, the agreements were not even permitted to be publicized. And in the United States, this is a free society, so we don't impose direct censorship. That is, we permitted the New York Times to publish them. But in this free society, the media almost unanimously overcame that freedom by presenting a version of the agreements which was totally false on every instance, leading to the fact that we can now, most of the population undoubtedly now believes that the Paris Agreement said that the Saigon government is the legitimate government of South Vietnam and it has a right to defend itself against North Vietnam. If people don't believe that, they're really very sophisticated, because that's what the media say, overwhelmingly. So, and that's the way the same result is achieved in a free society. All right, furthermore, this is all at the level of rhetoric. There was correspondingly action corresponding to that rhetoric. Namely, in the Saigon government areas, that means in the U.S.-controlled areas, the regime announced at once shoot-to-kill orders in case anybody had the weird idea of believing that the freedoms guaranteed in the agreements applied to them. That was not going to be permitted. So like if anybody tried to move or, to another area or any of the things that were permitted by the agreements, the Thieu regime announced, no, you'll be shot and killed. Furthermore, and that was true of the whole structure of the agreements with respect to the internal affairs of South Vietnam, there was never even any pretense that the Saigon government was going to observe them. In fact, it made it as clear as could possibly be done that it was not, just as we made it clear. And it furthermore then went on to implement those decisions with our backing. More significantly, the Saigon government began at once, again with American backing, it can't lift a finger without the United States, it's really an American client government, it began an offensive against the PRG areas. And that offensive was moderately successful. In fact, if you go back to, say, as recently as last summer, you find that Pentagon testimony in Congress was very optimistic about that Saigon government offensive, which they informed Congress had succeeded in capturing about 750 villages and had taken something on the order of 15% of PRG territory. And they were very pleased at the fact that the Saigon government was outgunning the opposition by a factor of 16-1, I think was the figure that they used. And, the Thieu government had announced that it was bombing freely in the, anywhere. And the Saigon government general in the Delta had announced that they'd soon have the whole Delta under control and so on. Oh, looked very nice. Well, that's the story of the first year after the Paris agreements. Namely, the United States, the Saigon government just simply censored the whole business. The American free society achieved the same effect by the device of the press lying about the agreements, while, allowing those fanatics who want to get the facts to read up in the New York Times about what it really said, the State Department bulletin and so on. And then policies were conducted which amounted to an offensive against PRG territories within South Vietnam and total suppression internal to the Saigon-controlled areas. Well, it was perfectly obvious that there was sooner or later going to be a response to that. This is just reliving the whole history of the Vietnam War. I mean, the same thing, exactly the same thing happened in 1954. The Geneva Agreements also laid a kind of a basis for settlement of the war. The United States at once took a decision to undermine those agreements in every particular. Those were sort of, less cynical days. In that time, the agreement was secret. We only learned about it explicitly when the Pentagon Papers came out. And you could read the decision of the National Security Council in August 1954 laying out an elaborate plan to undermine the Geneva Agreements. This time, Kissinger was justifiably just announced that we were going to totally disregard them, counting on the press to back him up on that, as they did. Okay, but then we went ahead, to try to crush the opposition in South Vietnam, to institute an American client regime, and so on, and sure enough, that led ultimately to a response. They weren't just sitting there allowing themselves to be knocked off. By 1959, there was a Vietnamese response in the South. Okay? Here's the same story. This time, times have changed. It's not 5 years now, it's like 1 year. And that's the story of what's happened. It was always inevitable that if the United States refused to permit those political accommodations to take place, and insisted rather on winning a military victory, then of course there would be a response. And given frankly, I'm surprised, I didn't predict that the degree of destructiveness within Saigon, the Saigon-dominated society was so enormous that the government would just collapse and riot and so on. That's a surprise to me. But that it wouldn't work, I mean, sure, of course, that was obvious. It's never worked in the past. There's nothing changed that'll make it work in the future.
couple of announcements. Mr. Halperin is scheduled to leave very shortly. Are there any questions at all for him before he goes? Okay, over there.
Peter Dale Scott has recently published an article in which he says that national security advisors were involved in Watergate, or what's called Watergate, but that either they were conspirators from within the Nixon domestic structure, or else that they were protected by the investigators of Watergate. In other words, that they weren't involved as others in the Nixon administration, but they were protected somehow or other. And I was wondering what was your view on this, seeing as how Kissinger is generally the main member of the Nixon administration.
Well, I think it is certainly true that there has been a tendency on the part of the Special Prosecutor's Office and the courts, as well as the media, to go easy on Kissinger's role in those parts of Watergate that we know he was involved in, namely the wiretaps and the plumbers. And it may be that as we begin this reevaluation of Henry Kissinger, people will go back and look at the preposterous things that he said about his knowledge of the plumbers operation, and the 6 versions, at least 2 of them under oath, totally contradictory about the origins of the wiretap program. But given the view, I think the dominant view was that Henry Kissinger was protecting the United States from evil forces in the world while we were settling the Watergate problem, and that therefore it was inappropriate to drag him into Watergate. But I suspect that that's going to begin to change now.
So you think it was a conscious effort to protect him?
Well, the difference between conscious conspiracies and very many people coming to the same conclusion is always a fine line. I think a lot of people knew what they were doing.
Okay, any other questions for Mr. Halperin? Yeah. How much real change will there be in the National Security Council, even if the climate in the country substantially changes? Is that what you're saying?
Like how much power corporations like use, like all these undeveloped nations, like as their as virgin territory.
Right.
Even if you put aside change, like these people are going to that power.
In other words, are the corporations going to just give in and let these kind of changes occur?
How much do they like influence?
And what is their influence?
Well,
okay.
I think that there could be very fundamental changes in American policy if we had a very different kind of president and a very different kind of national security advisor, secretary of state, and so on. The question of the influence of large businesses on American foreign policy is obviously a very complicated and complex one, and I really don't think this is the time to start a debate about it. But I do want to say that nobody operating at the National Security Council level in the U.S. government talks about that issue, or as far as I can tell, even thinks about it. That if it is true that all this is being manipulated by large business corporations and the decisions of the National Security Council are influenced by that, it's by a very subtle process, which may in fact exist, having to do with people's ideological outlooks, having to do with the kinds of people that get into those jobs and so on. But there is no discussion at that level and no conscious calculation of how this will help either particular business firms or American business in general. It just doesn't happen. And I don't believe that it happens quietly in smaller meetings that I know nothing about. That those sort of things are simply not discussed. If these influences exist, they are much more subtle and maybe therefore much harder to get rid of than simply people consciously saying we must pursue this policy in Latin America because it'll help American business firms. That's just not the way it happens. I'm afraid I am going to have to go.
Thanks a lot. This gentleman over here has been...
How considerable, your estimate, will be the financial loss of private American multinational corporations due to communist confiscation of existing assets in South Vietnam?
How substantial will the losses to American corporations, private American corporations, be of communist confiscation of their assets in South Vietnam? Well, of communist confiscation of American assets in South Vietnam, the losses will be insubstantial, I would think. Pardon? I don't know any exact figures, and maybe somebody else does, but I think they're not great. See, the economic importance of South Vietnam, there is, I think, a significant, South Vietnam was always understood correctly, I think, to have a major role in American imperialism for economic reasons, but not because of things intrinsic to South Vietnam. The importance of South Vietnam in American planning lay in the context, essentially, of the domino theory. And before one laughs, it's worth remembering that the domino theory is true. Not the version of it that's sold to the public about, the South Vietnam, about the Viet Cong, conquering Indonesia and all that kind of stuff. That's obviously nonsense. But there is a version of the domino theory which was held, for example, which you read if you look at the National Security Council documents, or the top-level documents in the Pentagon Papers through the 50s and the early 60s, before finally the war got so big they didn't even bother talking about it anymore. But in the period when they could still lay out policy and talk about it rationally, they developed a version of the domino theory which was extremely plausible. And that version was that if Vietnam were unified under communist control, a successful society would arise. An economically and socially successful society would arise, and it would be a model. It would be a model for surrounding societies. It would achieve what they like to call ideological successes. That was the term they used. And these ideological successes could, they could radiate. For example, they could provide a model for a popular movement in Thailand, which might say, why not us, And they could do the same thing. And, it might go on to Malaya, and it might go on to Indonesia, and it might spread into South Asia. And if all of that happened, really serious things would begin to come apart in the American empire. What would happen would be that all of these regions would extricate themselves from the international imperial system, the capitalist imperialist system. And one consequence of, even that, okay, Southeast Asia we could stand, but what they expected to take place at that point was that the United States would lose control over Japan. See, everybody always understood that Japan was the workplace of the Pacific, or workshop of the Pacific, it was called. In other words, the industrial center of the Pacific. Now, Japan is a resource-poor country. It needs markets, needs resources. It's got to get them from somewhere. The United States can't provide them. Up to a point it can, but not completely. And in fact, if you look back at the Japanese-American relations in the 1950s, you discover that the United States quite overtly told Japan that if they would break relations with, there was a split inside the Japanese ruling class, or whatever euphemism you prefer, in the 50s, and there was a split over whether to kind of align themselves somehow with China and make that their trading partner and so on, or whether to stay strictly within the American imperial orbit. And as an inducement, the United States offered them access to Southeast Asia and South Asia. And it was taken, and it was important. And, it's no joke. A substantial part of Japan's exports go there, a substantial part of their investment, and so on. And it was felt, rightly or wrongly, and I think rightly, that if the United States did not hold South Asia and Southeast Asia for Japan, if we allowed the domino theory in the sense that I just described to operate, there could ultimately be a very serious erosion, maybe even leading to Japanese accommodation with an autarkic, independent, closed order in Asia, which the United States didn't care very much whether it was egalitarian or socialist or communist or fascist, whatever. As long as it was outside the American empire, that was no good. And you see, what that would really mean is that the United States would have lost the Second World War. That's crucial to understand. The Second World War was fought in the Pacific to prevent Japan from carving out an independent new order from which the United States would be excluded. And the United States was not prepared in 1955 to lose the Second World War. And it's in this context that South Vietnam was important, not because of its internal assets, not because of the oil offshore or any of that kind of stuff. These are minor things. What was important was the context of the domino theory in its rational form. And that form is not to be sneezed at. I think it's true.
Okay, here in the middle.
I'm going to ask this question. I don't really know who is the right person to answer, so if anybody feels like they can answer it, go ahead. supposed to get away from it. And I'm not really quite sure, do you feel this is propaganda that the media is putting out, or have somebody told them that the communists are going to kill them all, or why is it? It seems to me things would not be any worse, and probably would be better for them under the North Vietnamese. What is it they're running from, or are they really running?
Does everyone understand the question?
Now, one thing you have to remember, and this is even published, when whoever occupied Da Nang, you see three flags. The biggest one was for the national reconciliation. On the right is a flag for the national liberation, and on the left is a Saigon flag. This is very important because the action, or military or political or whatever you call it, has been done in order to protect and implement the Paris Agreement. It's not a military offensive. You know, in this country, everybody wants to be a military strategist. And somebody mentioned the 123rd Division. I don't know why people know all this division when they cannot do anything about that. But that is very important. It means that for the last 2 years, the question is, should he implement the Paris Agreement by himself or with the pressure of the United States? Nothing happened. And therefore, I think the question now is the implementation through a number of actions, both political and all this. Now, the question of refugees. If you take the situation today and the situation in 1946, which I know fairly well, and the situation in 1954, a great number of people has been pushed out to become refugees. In other words, the refugee become a hostage. That is very clear in 1954. That is very clear in the French side in 1946. But what you will see in the next few days, if things quiet down, it means that here we do something like long known in Phnom Penh, you will see a massive return to the homes. So at this moment, you know, to call these people refugees, nobody knows. Nobody knows how many. For example, I have relatives in Hue, and I don't know where they are. Are they staying or are they refugees? That's practically Norway. And this is another important thing. If the government wants to catalog these people as refugees, it means that they must have control over and take responsibility of. And they did not do any of these things. So how you can call these people refugees? You know, this term is because when you project like refugee, people immediately think that, oh, refugee from the communists. And that is intention of both mass media and all this. So we better wait in this country, implement the Paris agreements, and then you will see that probably there's only one refugee that's until in Florida. Because but it's no use to discuss it now.
Yeah, Fred, you want to add?
Just wanted to add one or two other points which seem to us important anyway. The first thing is put yourself in the position of someone in Ban Mi Tuat, let's say, who for 20 years, 10 years, 5 years has not seen the other side operating publicly, openly, doesn't know about their system. They're advancing, they're perhaps doing a little shelling, depends on the area. Suddenly the Saigon army breaks and runs. Many of them may well be related to the refugee in question. The Saigon government announces a policy of scorched earth. In the past, whenever you stayed when the PRG came in, your village would be flattened. There has been considerable bombing, much less than under the United States, but considerable bombing over the last 2 years, if one believes the reports that one reads in, for example, the Foreign Broadcast Information Service reports from PRG zones. Every day there's an announcement of 5, 10 bombings here, there, describing the number of houses killed, destroyed, number of people killed. And there's a general kind of mass panic that sets in. I don't think the media has been consciously distorting in the sense of not deliberately making things up. But once again, this is a Western war. It's always been told from the Western point of view. For example, we don't know how many people remain behind. So there are 4, 5, 6 million people living in the northern part of South Vietnam and Central Vietnam. There's talk of 500,000, 2 million refugees. Well, there are a lot of people who remain behind. There are no media there to report that. Personally, we don't feel that the flight of refugees demonstrates that they're all running from communism. We think they're running from the war. Well, I can go on, but that's basically how we feel.
On changes that are needed in this society here, is your vision, let's say, for America's future and how that might be needed?
Well, that's, could you hear the question? Yeah. Well, that's really a long and important story in itself, and I won't try to say anything really serious about it in a minute or two. But my feeling really is that, first of all, I'm much less optimistic than Fred is about significant changes. I don't see them coming, either here or in the international system. I don't think that the American empire has dealt all that a severe blow. I think it's still strong, and I don't see any organized forces, at least here, that are moving towards significant social change. I wish it were otherwise, but that's what it looks like. It seems to me that the changes that are needed in American society, basically they fall under the, one could say simply put them under the name of democracy. I mean, if you believe that social and economic and political institutions ought to be controlled by the people who are affected by their decisions, let's say, supposedly that's what democracy is all about, then, okay, that's a reasonable goal for any society. We don't have a democratic society. We never have pretended to. In fact, we have a society which is based on the principle of opposition to democracy, and that's important to understand. I mean, we have a society which is based on the principle of political democracy, which means that one particular class of institutions must be under democratic control. And those institutions, while not unimportant, are sort of marginal in importance with respect to people's lives and to policy and so on. If you simply ask yourself how, say, your life, or the life of a Vietnamese, or anybody's life for that matter, is affected by decisions made within the political arena within which you allegedly have a voice, the answer is very few. Most of the decisions over your life and our lives are made by other institutions, by the important institutions that certainly in an industrial society, namely the economic institutions. And those institutions, in law and in principle, are out of democratic control. Rather, those institutions are to be run by what we would call fascist structures if it was politics. That is, by totally authoritarian structures, hierarchically controlled at the top through ownership, which delegates management and so on. And that means that individuals in the society, though we don't have slavery, we don't sell people anymore, we do something not terribly different. We rent them. It means that people have to rent themselves out to, to essentially fascist style, or whatever name you want to give, authoritarian institutions, which make the essential decisions of our lives. Okay, that means that democracy, at best, is a very limited phenomenon, limited to the political arena. And even there, the limitations are enormous because of the fact that, see, like Mort was saying, that in the National Security Council meetings they didn't talk about business interests. Well, yeah, I mean, they didn't, they also didn't talk about the fact that the sun was shining or something. I mean, nobody would even get to that point and couldn't possibly be anywhere near that system unless he already shared all the fundamental assumptions. I mean, I saw just a marvelous example of that this afternoon. I mean, I was talking at the Georgetown Law School on things like this, and the dean was there and was kind of upset. And at one point, I had said something about, capitalist imperialism or something of that sort, and he said, well, he didn't want to use a pejorative term like capitalism. But why is, that's a very interesting remark. What makes capitalism a pejorative term? I mean, it's just a descriptive term. It describes the system under which allegedly we live. Why is it pejorative? Well, the reason it's pejorative, it's a good point. They're really important. We're not allowed to use the word. If anybody, there's a taboo over the word. If anybody names the system, he's violated the taboo. And that's quite important. See, that's related to Kissinger's objection to those Marxist-Leninists who deal with objective factors. See, it's very important not to mention the word, or not to mention the factors, or not to mention the major elements, the major, the real ways in which power is exercised. You're not allowed to talk about those things in universities, in the press, and if somebody breaks the taboo, deans shudder. I mean, it's a pejorative term and so on. And that relates to, that shows the extent, the really profound extent to which the thought controls are exercised. I mean, not only can't you have the wrong ideas, you can't even use the words that describe the system. That's pretty extreme, that, of course, is the reason, that's part of the reason why questions of that sort never even come up in meetings. I mean, everything's understood. But the point is, until the fundamental institutions of the society are placed under democratic control, it's sort of, it's nice to have what little range of freedom there is around the periphery, but it's not terribly meaningful. See, what it means is in this society that let's be clear about what it means. It means that, a person is not for sale, but he's for rent. And it also means that everything else is essentially is on the market. And including the things that are on the market are your freedom. Freedom is a commodity. You can buy it and sell it. If you're wealthy, you can buy a lot of it. That's why the rich support the system of civil liberties. They like it. They are not, until a real threat appears, they are not the ones who oppose the system of civil rights for an extremely good reason. They are the ones who can purchase that freedom. If you live in a ghetto somewhere, it's all meaningless anyway. You can't purchase the freedom. In this society, there is a way to purchase freedom, namely to have capital, to build yourself a private space within which the freedoms are available to you. And that means that freedom is going to be very badly distributed, like every other commodity. Now, that's always going to be true, and one should have no illusions about it, as long as there is a system of private ownership of resources and productive resources. It's always going to be true. And the only way to there is an alternative system, and that is one in which is based on popular control of institutions, which would mean workers' councils in industry and the community assemblies and integrations of them and federations of that sort of thing and so on. Don't see any special reason to see why a state is necessary under such a system. It seems to me its functions are extrinsic. But I think that's a perfectly feasible system for an advanced industrial society. In fact, I think it's the most feasible system. And under that society, there really would be something like freedom available to people, and some moves towards equality and so on and so forth. And I think that's the system that we should be striving towards.
How do we get there?
Well, it's a very serious question, but there are, right. No, you're right, yeah. Well, there's only one answer to that, and that is organization. I mean, you get it the same way that the National Liberation Front was built up. It was built up by just a lot of people devoting their lives to organizing in the places where they live,